Hi, my name is James, and this is the second in a series of short videos which are designed to explain some of the thinking behind a new research-based professional development platform for teachers, praxiseducation.com. I should say right at the outset that when I use the word teachers, I really mean that as a shorthand for people who work in schools. I think that this platform and practitioner research more generally has just as much of a role to play in the professional development of teaching assistants and Senkos and people who work in pastoral support and so on, so please bear that in mind. As billed, this video will focus on providing a rationale for small-scale research inquiry as a basis for professional development. As I mentioned in the first video, this is not a new idea, and there's been this big surge of interest in recent years. There's almost like a hunger within the profession to engage more thoroughly with evidence-based practice, and teacher research in particular has benefited hugely from this, but we've got a long way to go before we embrace this fully as a profession. And hopefully this short video will go some small way to achieving that. Outlining a rationale for teacher research is not something that you can do very easily in 15 minutes because there's a fair bit to be said. And so this rationale will take the form of two short videos. In this video, I want to look at two key ideas. Number one, context is king, and number two, the problem of professional development. How do we continue to get better at our jobs over the course of a career? To begin with, I would like to explain a little bit about my own journey through teacher research because I think that it explains a key idea quite neatly. I'm a science teacher. I'm about to go into my 10th year in the profession, and for about the last 7 of those 10 years, I've considered myself to be a teacher researcher. I think that these are twin roles which complement each other really nicely. This started in 2008 when I signed up for a master's, a research-based master's. The first thing that I looked at in that course was self-esteem. And I had something of a light bulb moment when I did so, because self-esteem was a concept which I thought that I had some understanding of. It's a concept that you hear bandied around in schools a lot. And when I started to engage with the research literature and the philosophical and the theoretical literature around self-esteem, I found that lots of what I thought I knew perhaps wasn't as true as I thought it might be, and actually self-esteem is really quite a slippery and counterintuitive concept. And so I had my eyes opened that engaging with the literature could really make me think very differently about things that I thought I understood quite well. And I had a second light bulb moment of a different nature when I came to do my dissertation for my master's, which looked at a thing called philosophy for children as an approach for teaching PSHE. This was an intervention that was based around 6 lessons in which I used philosophy for children. It's a discussion-based approach to teaching and learning, and I recorded these sessions and then typed up everything that I said and everything that the kids said and looked at how many times they spoke and what sorts of things they said and so on, and did all of this number crunching on it and qualitative looking at what was said as well. And basically it didn't work in anywhere near the ways that I wanted it to work or that I hoped it might work. For a whole range of reasons. I was really new to the approach. I do advocate philosophy for children as an approach to certain things in education. I've subsequently found ways of making it work in aspects of my own practice, but this particular intervention didn't work very well. And so I spent about 6 months doing this study and writing it up. And that sounds like a long time to spend of one's one and only life writing about something that didn't work, doesn't it? You might think, well, why would you want to do that? And I was thinking the same at the time. But when I went back to teaching that September, I found that my practice had fundamentally been transformed. Having thought about my practice so deeply and reflected so hard about what learning is and the role of speaking and listening in learning and thinking and reasoning and so on, I found that I behaved differently, I responded differently to the students, and I understood things more deeply than I previously had done. And so the second light bulb moment was that something that doesn't necessarily work in terms of giving you a lovely big effect size and it allows you to draw a nice big graph to show how good you are, can actually be really, really powerful as a method for professional development. We say this to kids all the time, don't we? We learn from our mistakes, and this was the point at which I started to embrace that for myself. I suppose a downside of that, if you like, was that by now I was hooked on teacher research, and I thought that I wanted to take it further. So I signed up for a PhD. And at first I looked at something called Learning to Learn as a framework for exploring evidence, a whole range of evidence-based approaches to closing the attainment gap between disadvantaged students and their peers, and raising overall attainment of students at Key Stage 3, ages 11 to 14. Learning to Learn focuses centrally around two key ideas: self-regulation, students' abilities to evaluate their own learning and to monitor their learning and to adjust their behaviors accordingly; and metacognition, students' abilities to think about themselves as learners, to think about the processes of learning and to think about thinking itself, and to become more reflective learners, if you like. I soon realized that speaking and listening are really key in developing these things. Speaking and listening has also been referred to as oracy, in an attempt, justifiably in my view, to equate these ideas with things like literacy and numeracy as powerful ideas in the education of young people. I think that oracy has often been overlooked, and in fact it can even be used to drive forward student attainment in literacy and numeracy. In particular, I was looking at a thing called exploratory talk, which is a type of interaction that can happen between students or people more generally, adults even, whereby we share our ideas very equitably, we give reasons for our thinking, we challenge each other in ways that don't upset one another, and so on. And we can engineer ways of making this happen more and more in our classrooms. And I was also very interested in public speaking and debating as ways of getting students to become more confident in their communication skills, which employers are always telling us are lacking generally in school leavers. Thinking about how to put all of this together into an educational program got me thinking about evidence-based curriculum design, and then how to deliver that program, evidence-based pedagogical approaches. How do you actually deliver this stuff in ways that are effective? Then I started to think about how this whole enterprise is situated within a much broader debate, the so-called knowledge versus skills debate, and I had to think about my position, or the position of this work, in relation to that broad context, and even whether or not that debate exists is fiercely contested. And then I started thinking about evidence-based practice more generally, and how that phrase suggests a degree of objectivity, doesn't it? Evidence-based practice, if we can just find out what works and then we'll all do that, then everything will be better. But actually, the way in which we as human beings interact with so-called objective reality is through subjective lenses, which are often shaped by our values. You know, what do we think education is for? By our ideological perspectives, by a whole range of biases and preferences that we carry around with us, and how we engage with objective aspects of truth, if you like, are often very subjective and quite often perhaps even irrational. So that got me interested in looking at how we use language to interpret the world and how we use language to construct social reality. And so that got me interested in something called discourse analysis, which is the current focus of my research. So as you can see, by this point I am some way down the rabbit hole of teacher research, and I have thoroughly enjoyed and have felt stimulated all the way along at this sort of little intellectual journey, if you like, which is running parallel to my day job as a classroom teacher. And I know that there's a lot further that I have to go. I still consider myself absolutely a novice in terms of education research. But running throughout this whole journey, if you like, has been this problem about the gap that exists between research and practice. There's all of this research literature that backs up all of these ideas that are listed here. And that's like, you've got that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you've got what I do when I go into school in the morning. And how do we join these two things up in meaningful ways? That's a really huge problem, and I'm not the first person to grapple with this. It was written about very well by a chap called Donald McIntyre, who talked about teachers' everyday practice knowledge on the one hand, and this codified research knowledge on the other hand. The research knowledge which is codified within research journals and within all of the chapters of books, the endless books, my goodness, and through education conferences and research methodologies and all of that stuff. And so there's this huge gap. And Elaine Wilson has written really, really lucidly on this. She says that McIntyre, in talking about this gap, McIntyre suggests that this gap was created because the kinds of knowledge that research can offer are of a very different kind from the knowledge that classroom teachers need to use. Such codified research knowledge is not easily translated into practical knowledge because each classroom context is different, right? And what works for one teacher or in one school or with one class or on one occasion may not translate directly into action or into effective practice, if you like, in another. This is because each school is unique, each classroom is different. You get the idea. In other words, context is king. Now, I can't emphasize this point strongly enough. If this is true that context is king, and people do seem to talk about this, people seem to be starting to get a handle on this idea. If it's true that big studies of educational research can't really tell us much about the individual context in which we work, then we've got a big problem, haven't we? And we need to start thinking about educational research in such a way that takes account of the individual context, the nuanced context, and the ever-changing context of our professional lives. Really important idea. I'll come back to that in the later part of the next video. The second thing I want to talk about in this video is the problem of professional development. There's this graph which I've seen used at education conferences, which looks like this, and it's used to describe, it's sort of based on research, Hanushek and Rivkin. I've done some of it. It's based on this idea that teachers' professional development gets rapidly better, the steep learning curve as they call it, in that awful phrase, where the solid line there sort of represents reality, if you like. There's this sort of steep learning curve, and then there's a plateauing off of professional development, and the dotted line represents what we might sort of hope to see. If you equate this to something else, for example, like musical instruments, like playing the guitar, say, if you play the guitar for 5 hours a day, for 200 days a year, for 10 years, then you would expect to be pretty good, wouldn't you? And yet it certainly feels to me like I am bashing out the same 3 chords day after day. And so it feels like maybe there is a hint of truth to this graph. Now, if it is true, and if it is true that we could potentially continue to grow as teachers, and that's by no means certain, but if that is true, then how can we do that? How can we continue to grow over the course of a career? And how can we continue to tweak our practice and to get better and better along the lines of, you know, practicing a musical instrument? Deliberate practice and feedback are obviously key to this. Before we move on, I would like to very briefly look at the question of how these teachers, Hanushek and Rivkin, how did they measure the impact? Because this looks like a simple thing, doesn't it? A simple piece of research. What's the relationship between how long somebody has taught for and what the students' results are like? Here's how they figured that out. I know, right? It's amazing, isn't it? That is just an amazing thing. Why did these researchers need to come up with such a complicated equation to model this relationship between 2 such simple variables, how long you've taught for and what kinds of results you get? The reason for this is really complicated, and I'm going to come on to this in the second part of this video, but for now I'll park it because I can't really look at that for too long. I'm sure you feel the same. The problem of professional development, to my mind, was outlined by this chap who you might recognize as Ted Ragg, the amazing and much missed education researcher and prolific writer and champion of teacher research and teachers in general. Ted Ragg once crunched some numbers and figured out that teachers make upwards of 1,000 evaluative decisions on any one given day, at the chalk face, as it were. Now that's an amazing thing to think about, isn't it? When I first saw that, I thought, that feels like a lot. I don't feel like I make 1,000 decisions a day. Like, you'd be exhausted, wouldn't you? But when you think about the fact that some of those decisions are sort of maybe pre-programmed by decisions that you've made in the past or by habits of behavior that you've established, if you think about how complicated or how busy a classroom is, how many students there are in there, what different problems each of those students present in terms of how to move their learning forward, and all the different stimuli that could trigger a response in a teacher's behavior. And you multiply that by 5 lessons, and you start to think, well, maybe, okay, other people have estimated this as upwards of 3,000 decisions. If you accept that as true, then a number of questions arise. Number one, what is the relationship between all of these decisions and student outcomes and school outcomes more widely? What are the multiple relationships between these decisions and student outcomes? Can we even find out what these relationships are? And if so, how? Secondly, how can we get better at making these decisions? This is the problem of professional development in a nutshell, isn't it? And secondly to that, how can we know when we're making better decisions? Because things are often counterintuitive, aren't they? And we have hunches and things turn out to not behave as we expected them to. So how can we even know when we're making better decisions? And thirdly, how can we know, more simply if you like, how can we know which aspects of our practice are the most useful and which might most usefully be jettisoned? As a hint towards what's coming in the next video, I think that the answer to all of these is small-scale teacher research inquiries, the basis of our professional development being small-scale inquiries to look at these relationships between the decisions that we take when planning and delivering lessons and student outcomes. In relation to this third point, there's a lot of anger among the profession. I'm sure that some people are aware, and also sort of embarrassment at certain ideas that have been wholeheartedly embraced by the teaching profession in recent years. Things like brain gym and learning styles. When I trained to teach, we had VAK on every single lesson plan, visual, auditory and kinesthetic learners. How were you tailoring your lesson planning to cater for the different learning styles of students in your classes? And it sort of feels like there might intuitively be a grain of truth to it, but when you look at the research, there's basically nothing there. There's nothing that supports this idea that you can actually teach more effectively by doing this. And so understandably, people feel a little bit sort of embarrassed by this, and we need to move on as a profession beyond this point where we are so easily suckered, if you like, by people telling us what to think and what to do. I think that perhaps more generously you could look at those things not necessarily as something to feel. I don't feel angry as such. I see it as like a developmental stage that the profession had to go through, almost like an embarrassing like adolescent haircut or whatever. I don't have to worry too much about that anymore. But either way, the time has come to move on beyond that stage. We do need to become more hard-headed in thinking about the things that we do and the reasons for which we do them. In the next video, I want to look at some problems associated with educational research, education research with a big R, and how small-scale inquiry can help us to overcome some of those problems. But until then, thank you very much for watching.